Hi there, and welcome back to Judaism Unbound. This is Lex speaking, and I know this is different from how we start most of our episodes, but this is a special episode. This is our Yom Kippur bonus episode, and we're actually re-releasing a set of episodes that we released a year ago. These were commentaries on the Torah and Haftarah readings for Yom Kippur that Dan and I schmoozed about, and we wanted to re-release them because over the past year we've had a lot of folks jump on the Judaism Unbound bandwagon, and y'all who are new to the show might not have seen these last year, and we wanted to give you a chance to listen because we got some good feedback on them. We also wanted to put them out there in case any of you who did listen want to refresh yourselves on our Judaism Unbound look at these texts and, give us your feedback, your thoughts, your questions. We also wanted to plug our High Holidays Unbound, which you can access on our website, judaismunbound.com, which has these episodes, which has a set of Rosh Hashanah commentaries, which has all sorts of other alternative ways for engaging with the high holidays, especially with Yom Kippur. And we hope that you'll give that a look and have it inform your holiday experience. So without further ado, here are our Yom Kippur bonus episodes.
This is a special edition of Judaism Unbound, the High Holiday Readings. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
And we're here with a special edition of Judaism Unbound today that actually is putting together a number of shorter pieces that you can find on our website, www.judaismunbound.com, in our special section on the High Holidays. We're going to be talking about each of the traditional readings for the High Holidays and looking at them with a Judaism Unbound perspective to try to find a way to see whether these traditional readings can still be relevant to us today as we potentially look at these holidays in a new way.
All right, so we are continuing on with our next text. This is the reading for the morning of Yom Kippur, the Torah reading for the morning of Yom Kippur, and it comes from the book of Leviticus, chapter 16, almost exactly in the middle of the 5 books of Moses. Leviticus is the third book, and this is about midway through that third book. And what this passage is about, it comes from a Torah portion called Acharei Mot, which means after the death, which is referring to the recent death of Aaron's 2 sons who had brought some sort of strange fire to God. And here what we see is this very strange ritual of atonement that theoretically we trace the holiday of Yom Kippur back to. That's why this reading is read on Yom Kippur. And it's all about these scapegoats and the way in which we metaphorically, or maybe it was meant to be literal, placed our sins on these goats, one of whom would be killed and one of whom would be sent to something called Azazel, which has been interpreted in all sorts of different ways. But it's really a bizarre ritual to contemporary readers, for sure, and maybe even to ancient readers, who knows. But Dan, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what this is getting at.
I don't know what it's getting at, but I'll tell you sort of what it puts me in the mind of as I think about it. I mean, first of all, in the very last part of this section, yes, you're right. The way you introduced it was that Aaron's sons are killed because they brought this strange fire, and it appears that Aaron has to make some kind of atonement. And then at the very end, it says, and then they specifically talk about Yom Kippur on the 10th day of the 7th month. That's the date of Yom Kippur. You shall do these kind of various things, and has a bunch of things that you should do. So, but that big middle section, and that sort of then it's like looked back at as that was what would have happened on Yom Kippur, this whole big atonement thing that's described with the goats and everything. And when I read it, I mean, really, my basic impression is that this is just bizarre. And I know, and I think I've read somewhere, kind of Freudian type of interpretation of this to explain, psychologically how all this kind of stuff might have been working. And I think that that's brilliant and really interesting. And probably, right, when we look at any kind of ancient ritual, there are these like psychoanalytic views that can explain to us why those were the sacred rituals. Like, where did these people come up with this stuff? Like, it wasn't random, it really did come from certain ideas and metaphors that if you really dig deep into them, they could really make some sense to us even today, right? But I want to look at it in a different way, which is that I think that the vast majority of people, including, rabbis, look at a story like this and they look at it as like bizarre. It's not something that we would want to do again today. Even if the Messiah came, hopefully he won't bring back this kind of thing because it's too crazy, And the thing that it puts me in the mind of is just that that's how a lot of people today look at what is done today in the synagogue. With exactly the same kind of astonishment. Like, do you mean to tell me that you're sitting there for, 6 hours praying to a God that doesn't exist and praying in a language that you don't really understand? And how can you possibly sit through this boredom and, yada, yada, yada? And I think that for all of those of us, or I should say those, because that's not really me, who sit in the synagogue and read this text and say, oh, what crazy there was, 3,000 years ago in the temple, would be to imagine that that's what's being said about us by the people that are not coming to synagogue, right? And I wonder, again, like I feel like if you invite people to look at it that way, then it's a wonderful text to be reading on this day of Yom Kippur, this day of personal but also communal introspection and recentering, right? And if I sit there, once a year and I read a text about how children always think their parents are crazy, then my first thought is like, yeah, my parents are crazy, but my second thought is like, oh yeah, my children must think that I'm crazy, right? And once I get to that thought, then hopefully the question is, can I forgive my parents for their craziness? And what do I have to do to sort of make it so that my children won't think that I'm crazy, right? And I worry that we don't have that reaction to texts like this. That we, when we sit at the synagogue and we read a text like this, we somehow imagine, right, that there was this old ritual during the temple times, or even more ancient than that, and it ended because the temple was destroyed. And instead, the rabbis invented this new approach called, prayer. And everything's been fine ever since. And this is the way Judaism should go on forever. And if there are all these other people that are out there saying, but we don't connect with this, that there's something wrong with them. And, again, this is a theme that we've been exploring over and over in our show. What would it be like if we flipped the lens and we said that those folks who are not participating in these services, they are dissenters, and they are actually ones who should be listened to because maybe they're actually the first leading edge of the recognition that what we've been doing in this alternative form of Judaism is no longer working, and that we need a new alternative form of Judaism. And just as we're comfortable sitting here in the synagogue and understanding that we have a completely new form of Judaism that is totally like not at all like what's being described in this reading, that we can also imagine a time in the future where people will be doing something else entirely, and maybe they'll have a reading about how it used to be in the synagogue, and that would be okay.
Yeah, I think you're totally right. And I want to take a step back and actually I want to compliment Jewish evolution, because when I look at this text, I share all of the responses that you do in terms of bizarre being an adjective that springs to mind. I would even say I'm repulsed in certain ways. Like the idea of killing a goat because I and my community have done things wrongly, without getting into issues of the fact that I'm a vegetarian. But like, even if I weren't, like, that's beyond bizarre to me. It's just like really bad. And the way the history worked out, it wasn't this direct, but, over time, we discarded this ritual. And for a while, we didn't really have anything. We had prayers, I guess, but there wasn't an observance on Yom Kippur, on the high holiday season, that would resemble sort of putting our sins on some other object to hold ours, in the sense that the goats were. But then, in the Middle Ages, we came up with one. And for those who listen to the podcast, you'll recognize where I'm going. It's tashlich, which I've brought up here and there before. It's where we sort of put our sins on pieces of bread and throw them into bodies of water. So here's what I'd say about that. For many folks, that is equally bizarre, to share the adjective that Dan did, and may not be meaningful. I think that it might be superstitious, it might be bizarre, and I validate and hear that. what I will say is that I think it's a great improvement over this other version of sort of scapegoating. I mean, that's what it is. That's where the term scapegoat comes from. So I think that what this story brings up for me, it's not a story, but what this element of our text brings up for me is that we really do have the potential to take these wonky rituals and improve upon them, contemporize them, modernize them in ways that will work for more people. Maybe it is that even those new versions like Tashlich won't work forever, and maybe they're already not working for a lot of people. But because of that precedent, I'm confident that we can take, our out of style bread ritual and come up with something new that will be meaningful in the future.
And one more thing to add from that is that I think it's really interesting that I heard you describe that was like, we had this scapegoat idea, we got rid of it, we replaced it with prayer, which is a completely different thing. But then many years, like 1,000+ years later, somebody said, hey, let's go back to that scapegoat thing, but now let's do it with bread.
Yeah.
Right. So the point is that, and maybe not, that still works today. But the point is that in addition to replacing things that no longer work, we also have the capacity to reach deep into the past and pull forward things that may work again that hadn't been working for a long time. And that's also an exciting thing. We interviewed folks about the Maim Chaim mikveh in Boston, and in my mind, that's an example of something that, at least in liberal Judaism, had been discarded for a long time, and rightly so. And then some people realized, hey, we can reach back for it now because we've been away for it for long enough, and maybe now we can reboot it in some way that makes it more interesting and relevant for us today. And that's always something that's also in our pocket. And I would say that, like, one of the technologies that I think is most wonderful about Judaism that allows for that is that we have this idea of studying things we no longer practice. And that's where, I think what we're doing now in talking about these texts and imagining that it's not that, like, we should stop reading these texts on the high holidays. What we're asking ourselves in this series is, like, can we read these texts in a different way so that they're still, useful? And if not, we should probably still read them, because that's one of the Jewish technologies, so that when the time comes when some of this stuff is relevant again, we can know about it and reach back for it, as opposed to having forgotten about it completely.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And on that note, we're going to close out this mini episode. We hope you've enjoyed this look at the Torah reading for the morning of Yom Kippur. And there's also a number for Rosh Hashanah in case you missed those and you want to take a peek, take a listen to what we had to say about Rosh Hashanah's texts. So we hope that you'll check out those other ones. You can find them on iTunes or Google Play or on our website, JudaismUnbound.com, under our Listen and Learn track of our High Holidays Unbound initiative. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. We hope you enjoyed the first section of this episode on the Yom Kippur morning Torah reading, Leviticus 16. And next up, we've got the Yom Kippur morning Haftorah reading, which is from Isaiah chapters 57 and 58. Here it is.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
So we're now getting into the next text, which is the Haftorah reading for the morning of Yom Kippur. It is from the book of Isaiah, chapter 57, verse 14, through chapter 58, verse 14. And the basic, this again is not a story. It's more of a kind of prophetic statement. The famous part of this statement or prophecy by Isaiah is Isaiah's quoting God as saying the following thing. This is starting in verse 5 from chapter 58. Is such the fast I desire, a day for men to starve their bodies? Is it bowing the head like a bulrush and lying in sackcloth and ashes? Do you call that a fast? A day when the Lord is favorable? No. This is the fast I desire, to unlock fetters of wickedness and untie the cords of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free, to break off every yoke. It is to share your bread with the hungry, and to take the wretched poor into your home. When you see the naked, to clothe him, and not to ignore your own kin. Then shall your light burst through like the dawn, and your healing spring up quickly. So it goes on from that, but really the basic idea of this Haftorah, to my mind, this is extremely sort of scandalous or subversive, right? The idea that on Yom Kippur, the day in which we're all focused on fasting and denying ourselves various comforts, that the reading that we read is where the prophet is saying, that's not what God wants. Right? And of course, people will say it's not that it's saying that you shouldn't fast. It's saying you shouldn't only fast, right? It's not that God doesn't want us to fast. It's that God doesn't want us to only fast and still oppress people and still not care for the needy, etc. But I think you could read it that God actually doesn't care about the fast, and that really what is meant by a fast here is the idea that you should fast from your kinds of bad behaviors from the rest of the year. And one of the things from a historical, critical standpoint that I think is interesting to know about this part of the book of Isaiah is that scholars have found or hypothesized that the book of Isaiah is actually made up of 3 different scrolls, 3 different books that were written at 3 different times. One was written before the destruction of Judah, one was written during the Babylonian exile, and one was written after the return from the Babylonian exile. And this chapter would be from the part called Trito-Isaiah, the 3rd Isaiah, that was written after the return from the Babylonian exile. And so what would be going on here historically is that the Second Temple had been relatively recently built, and everybody was so excited that we had gotten to go back to our way of being Jewish from before we were destroyed. And isn't it great that we are, we're back? And here Isaiah comes and says, this is wrong. This is problematic. There's something that we learned during the exile, something that we maybe learned during this time when we didn't have our old ways that we're now forgetting because we're going back to our old ways. So sure, it's wonderful to be able to be in a position where we can really do these things unapologetically that we longed for so long, but let's not forget the other things that we were so focused on during the time when we didn't have a temple. And so, for me, I find that, again, one of these things where, if we think, for example, about the immigration to the United States and the idea that the Jewish community in the United States has become very successful over the last 100 years. And, more and more we have these wonderful synagogue buildings and these means and these and the laws are such that we can practice Judaism freely. And you can imagine that people just sort of focus and say, okay, let's just practice Judaism, and so it's sort of like strikes me as similar to what we discussed when we were talking about the Rosh Hashanah reading and the idea of what is a great nation. Does it mean great numerically or does it mean great in terms of impact? And I feel like at times in which the Jewish community may have been less wealthy, less well off in terms of being free to practice Judaism in America were times when we were more involved in the struggles of others in terms of civil rights and other labor rights and other kinds of movements, and now that the Jewish community is more stable and solid, a concern that I hear from many social justice activists that we have left some of that behind. And so for me, I think it's really interesting to reflect on that historical question of who Isaiah was in his time, and also to reflect upon the message itself, which is that, again, who knows exactly what Isaiah was trying to achieve. And obviously a more conservative reader will say, no, he was just meaning something supplementary to what was going on in the temple. But I want to take it to the radical place and say what Isaiah is recommending here is a different Judaism.
Yeah, I'm thinking to a story that you, Dan, and I actually shared with one of our listeners. We were visiting a listener and friend of the show in Florida, and he was telling a story. He's very involved with a few different kinds of advocacy, and he was relating a conversation he had with a friend of his who called herself a bad Jew. She said, I'm not a very good Jew." Pretty typical story. I think she, hadn't gone to services in many, many years, and all of these things that historically people might think of as, those are markers of, decisions that go against the Jewish grain. And this listener, our friend, he responded to her, "I'm talking to you because we're meeting about pancreatic cancer research. You work professionally for this incredible organization trying to heal sick people. Like, you're the most Jewish person I know." And I heard that story, And I just nodded my head vigorously because of course, like, and people think that that's this dumbing down or this watering down of Judaism to imply, no, Judaism really is in the end just about doing good work on this planet while we're here. I don't think it's dumbing it down. Like, I think if God willing, we could all be as dumbed down as individuals such that we spend hundreds of hours of our lives every year doing work to make the world better in whatever corners we can. And I think that's what this text is saying. I think that's what Isaiah is saying. It's saying, no, like those rituals are, whether or not it's saying you do or you don't need to do those anymore. Like, forgetting that for a second, it's saying the key work is helping the poor, feeding those who are hungry. That the list that it keeps going with. And you know, as you spoke about social justice activists, I think of myself as one, and I'm in some circles with many others, and I often hear in comment threads or otherwise, well, you should just be honest with yourself, because it's fine that you do what you do, but like, your religion isn't Judaism, your religion is the left, or your religion is progressivism, or your religion is social justice. And okay, like, first off, if somebody were to say, yes, my religion is no longer Judaism, instead my religion is going to be social justice, and I'm going to spend my life doing social justice, that would not be a tragedy to me. That would be good for the world. I would like them. I think Judaism can help with that. I think this text is evidence of that. But God willing, people make social justice part of whether it's their religion or their daily lives. I think that's what this text teaches us.
Yeah, and it gets to this question, I think, which is really a modern question, which is, of what good is Judaism? Why be Jewish? And, I think some people can, and I have respect for people who say that the reason why they're Jewish is because they believe that God commanded it and they want to follow God's commands. Fine. But I think for the vast majority of people, of Jews today, that is not what they believe. And the question is, if they don't believe that, does Judaism still have something for them? And what I think is that if it does, it would be something like, if you take seriously Judaism, whether it's ideas or its practices or new ideas or practices that would emerge out of its crucible, out of its material, the remix that we've talked about, that somehow those would help you live the kind of life that you want to live, and that you hopefully want to live a kind of life in which you make a contribution to the world, and that the only value of Judaism is because it somehow enables you to live that life. And in a way, the way I read this text today, as I'm sort of thinking about it, is that it's raising the question. It's saying, if this doesn't help you do that, then stop doing it. If fasting helps you stop oppressing the poor and help those in need, great. But if fasting isn't doing that, then it's not that you should stop being Jewish. I think it's that Judaism needs some major surgery, and I think that's an open question today, whether that's the case or not. And if it is, then the question is, what would that look like?
Yeah, that what would it look like question is a really big one. And on the note of that question, we're going to close out this episode that looked at the Haftorah reading for the morning of Yom Kippur. We want to encourage you to check out our other readings. You can find those on JudaismUnbound.com in our Listen and Learn track of the High Holidays Unbound initiative, or on iTunes, Google Play, wherever you typically listen to our podcast. And with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. We hope you enjoyed part 2 of our 4-part episode. Next up, we've got part 3, the Yom Kippur afternoon Torah reading, Leviticus chapters 18 and 19.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofus.
So now we're going to our next reading, which is the reading for Mincha, the afternoon service of Yom Kippur, and it comes from Leviticus chapter 18. The main ideas here, this is a whole list of essentially sexual improper behavior, right, Lex? That is just listed here. At the end, it says you shouldn't defile yourselves in these ways, and you should stay away from these kind of, quote, abhorrent practices. the thing that I really wanted to bring attention to this, instead of, I think, what often people might try to do, which is to hide it, is to focus us on, I think, something that a lot of people don't realize, that the famous line from Leviticus, the anti homosexuality line, which is Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22, "Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence or an abomination." That is in this chapter. So it's not only that we read this chapter traditionally once a year on the Shabbat when this part of Leviticus comes up, but it's actually read every year a second time on Yom Kippur as part of this reading for the afternoon service of Yom Kippur. And for me, two thoughts went into my head. One is that maybe we shouldn't read that anymore. That maybe, and I think that there are many congregations that instead read Leviticus chapter 19, which we'll talk about shortly, but as an alternative, both for positive reasons, there's some good stuff in there, and some sort of negative reasons, right? We don't want to read chapter 18. But for me, at least, the one thing that I would want to put out there as a possibility is that it's actually valuable to be confronted with, in a way, like the worst verse. I don't know if it's the worst. There's some other really bad verses in the Bible. But one of the really bad verses that we really don't like today and we really think is like profoundly wrong. And I think it's interesting to read that every year on this day of atonement from sin, right? And to imagine, and I don't think this is the reason why it was chosen. In fact, I'm pretty sure it was not the reason that it was chosen. But it strikes me that a reason that it is still highly relevant is because, in a way, this line is one of the great things that Judaism as a culture has to atone for, that we have a line like this in our sacred literature. And I think that it's kind of a beautiful idea. Maybe if we're going to change the readings for Yom Kippur, why don't we create a collection of all the terrible verses from the Bible that we no longer approve of, and let's read all of them for the Mincha service for Yom Kippur, and essentially say we atone for having these lines, and nevertheless, just as we can't get rid of the terrible things that we've done in our youth, right? Especially if it may have caused damage to somebody, we can't actually get rid of it. There's, that's one of the great pieces of wisdom that sometimes what's done is done, but we can move forward from them. And so, maybe there's something here. And of course, it's easy for me to say as someone who's not directly affected personally by this line. And I would certainly have great respect for people who would say it's too painful for me to have this line. And to tell you the truth, I walked out of the synagogue when this line was read on Shabbat in the most recent year. When I realized that was being read, I couldn't stay in the synagogue. But on Yom Kippur, I kind of feel like maybe I can read it in a different way and to say, I'm reading this because it is so problematic and hateful. And this is a holiday in which we want to be confronted with the worst of ourselves so that we can move on from it. So if that's of value, that's at least something that caught my mind this year in terms of this reading.
I think it gets at a really huge question, which is what it means to engage with Jewish text or religious text, or maybe some would call holy text. Is it that the content that we are reading should be morally supportable content, and that what we are gaining by doing this is sort of gleaning teachings from a text that are good? If that's the case, then I'm really uncomfortable doing that exercise with chapter 18, because I think that it's not morally good. And entering into a relationship with this text where the idea is I am moving myself forward as a person through what this text is teaching me and the way I would learn from a teacher, I'm not comfortable with that. If what makes a text special or worthwhile is that regardless of whether you agree with it or not, it can deepen your relationship with the world. It can cause you to be a better version of you. Then I think engaging with this text is really important, especially on Yom Kippur, for all the reasons you said. And I often talk to people about my own relationship with various texts in Judaism. And my least favorite ones aren't the ones that I disagree with most. My least favorite texts are the ones that I just don't have anything to say about. Which does happen. As I'm a rabbinical student, technically, if I'm never going to be able to say I just don't have any thoughts on this. I'll have to say something if I have to give a spiel. But sometimes I don't have anything. And those texts are not that interesting to me. When I really hate a text, this text has directly been used to deeply injure people that I care about. That text, I don't see, to me, I can engage with that and grow through it in a way that some neutral text I couldn't. And because I don't come into the relationship with this text with the assumption that I'm going to like it in terms of what it's saying. So I do agree with you that engaging with chapter 18 is a worthwhile and important exercise. That said, for those who do opt for chapter 19 or whose custom it's been to do that for whatever reason, we wanted to give a little bit of an addendum related to that chapter. That's what people often will do if they don't read chapter 18 in their community. The Reform movement has that as their custom, and many Reconstructionist congregations also. And chapter 19 is where we have one of the most famous statements in the Torah, which is love your neighbor as yourself. Ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha. And I think that it's almost too obvious how relevant. I don't feel like I'm saying anything too insightful when I say that on Yom Kippur, this can be a valuable text to look at. Maybe that's why it was chosen as the alternate to chapter 18, is that really it dovetails incredibly well, because on Yom Kippur, we are in the midst of this exercise of thinking very deeply about ourselves and where we have failed. And if we are able to forgive ourselves on that front, and we accept the premise that we love our neighbors as ourselves, then as a result, as a corollary, we would therefore be able to forgive our neighbors.
Well, one thing that I just want to go back and talk about in terms of 18 is that line about same-sex relationships. I want to note that it can also be reinterpreted in ways that and has been in ways that maybe don't make it mean what it appears to mean, and I have great respect for that. And there's also a school of thought that says certain kinds of lines can be removed from the Torah. Even the Talmud gives permission for that in certain extreme cases. And even if those things were done, I still think it would be valuable on Yom Kippur to confront that text in its most raw form as a sin. So I just want to put out there that, as one of many options. In terms of the question of love their neighbor as yourself, I mean, again, it feels like all the more dramatic to think about that line in contrast with the line from Leviticus 18. Because that seems like such a failure to live up to love your neighbor as yourself. And that it becomes even more dramatic to see a few verses later the idea of love your neighbor as yourself. And, I don't know, I guess for me, in thinking about that, one of the challenges that it feels like it places before me is that I feel empowered to use a line like that to look back at the rest of the lines in the Torah that don't conform to it, and to challenge myself and to say, is there a way in which maybe I'm misunderstanding those other lines? Because, Rabbi Akiva said, love your neighbor as yourself is the greatest commandment in the Torah, right? Everything else is a commentary to it, or is a version of it, right? And so if that's the case, then can I try to give myself a challenge to try to interpret everything else in light of you should love your neighbor as yourself? Or alternatively, does that give me license to dispense with stuff that doesn't conform to that, to that greatest principle? And again, I think that as we move forward and ask ourselves these questions of, as we have this cycle of the year that we think of as not only our own personal penitence, our own personal reflection, but a sense of reflection about Judaism itself, that these are some of the questions that I feel we're permitted and I would say we should start to feel encouraged to make every year, and to really ask ourselves at least once a year, let's look hard in the mirror, in the communal mirror, in the mirror of Judaism as a whole, and ask ourselves, maybe this year is time to do some work.
Yeah, I agree with you. And that's going to be the closing thought for this reflection on the Torah reading for Yom Kippur afternoon. And we hope that you will listen to all the other readings that we've recorded thoughts on. And you can find those at judaismunbound.com under High Holidays Unbound in our Listen and Learn track, or on iTunes, Google Play, whichever podcast location you like to use. So with that, this has been Judaism Unbound. That concludes the third part of this four-parter, and the last is Yom Kippur's Haftorah reading for the afternoon. It's a whale of a book, the Book of Jonah.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Dan Levinson.
And I'm Lex Rofus. For our final reading, we're going to look at the Haftorah reading for the afternoon service of Yom Kippur, which is the Book of Jonah, the whole book. It's 4 chapters, so you pack the whole thing into that afternoon service. And the Book of Jonah is, on one level, it's a story. It's an entire story, beginning, middle, end, which is different from some of the other readings that we've looked at, really all of them that are placed in the midst of longer books like Leviticus or Isaiah or Jeremiah, etc. But the Book of Jonah, the content of the story is that you've got a protagonist whose name is Jonah, who initially, he's in conversation with God, so he's a prophet, and the issue of concern relates to the city of Nineveh, which is the capital of Assyria, which is facing the possibility of destruction. And initially, Jonah wants to prevent that destruction. What happens is there's this intriguing boat journey that Jonah goes on. He is in a position where he's disobeyed God, and the result is that there's consequences for the entire boat. There's torrential weather that endangers everyone, and he realizes that it's his fault, so he jumps off and in order to save the rest of the people on the boat, and he's swallowed by a big fish, a dag gadol, and he's in this big fish for 3 days, and eventually is sort of spit or vomited up, and eventually God actually makes the decision not to destroy the city of Nineveh. And Jonah is aggravated by this. Jonah now at this point thinks that God should have exercised that attribute of more judgment oriented. And Jonah says so. And then it concludes with this fascinating parable where there's this tree that God puts right near Jonah to provide some shade, and it's there for a short while, and then God destroys the tree, and Jonah is outraged and ready to, die for this tree. And sort of the moral of that is that, if Jonah, if you were willing to die on behalf of this, tree, how can you imagine how difficult it would be for me to put the lives of all these human beings I've created in Nineveh on the line by destroying their city? So it's a jam-packed few chapters with a lot going on, but that's sort of a summary of the book.
Yeah, so do you have an angle on it that you think is a particularly Judaism Unbound angle?
Yeah, I do. And it relates to this issue with the big fish, with the dag gadol. So often, at least for me, and I think for others, my exposure to this story was primarily as sort of a cutesy child story without any of the big theological questions of what it means for God to destroy cities. It was just about, Jonah is swallowed by a whale. Fascinating. Maybe we'll draw a picture of it in Sunday school. That was my first engagement with this story. That wasn't a bad thing. I mean, it's fun. But as I grew older, I was in a variety of Jewish spaces where, a rabbi or somebody would be giving their spiel on this book, whether it was on Yom Kippur or elsewhere during the year, just because it's, a book in the Bible. And they would emphasize that it's not a whale. It's not. The character that we refer to as the whale is referred to in Hebrew as dag gadol, which means a big fish. And of course, we know now that whales aren't fish. Whales are mammals. And as a result, it would conceivably be anachronistic or incorrect to call it a whale when it says that in the text that it's a fish. And I think, and so for a while, I totally bought into that. And if people would tell me, in conversation reference Jonah and the whale, I would vigilantly correct them and say, no, not a whale, it's a fish. But so I was curious about this, and I looked into some of the linguistic history of Dag Gadol and how it's been translated into various languages over time. And there's basically a reason that we ended up with the conclusion that this is a whale. And the short of it is that when the Septuagint was written, which is the Greek translation of the Bible, it translated that word in a way that resembled a Greek version of big fish, but the term resembled a word for sea monster. Then it transitioned into Latin, still another language, and so we had a new connotation for this big fish, and it was related to a word that some might recognize from the word cetyl alcohol, but the Latin root is sort of the CET part, which relates to whales. And so it became a whale. And so on the one hand, we could look at this and say, what a shame. We lost the original intent of this story to be a big fish. Maybe it's not of huge concern to us whether it's a fish or a whale, but on some level we've lost that Hebrew Dag Gadol, and maybe that's a signifier that, we've lost a connection to this story or even to our way of interpreting text in general. The other way to relate to this is that maybe now it's a whale. Maybe the original writing of the text is not the only authentic version, and just because a new translation isn't true or faithful to that original, maybe it actually can be a whale now, if for whatever reason that adds to the story. I don't know enough about, the biology of whales to think about how that could impact the story. Maybe somebody else who's a marine biologist does. But on a broader level, I think this suggests that the way we interpret text in general can be open to these shifts over time. And we don't have to necessarily see them as mistakes that are to be corrected, but instead as new ways of understanding a text. So maybe now it's a sea monster, maybe it was a big fish. Maybe we can look at all of those and analyze the differences and see how that might impact our reading of the text. Dan, did you have any other thoughts?
Well, I was just going to ask you, so what if it is a whale or a big fish? But I understand that you're saying that it's a metaphorical issue, for sort of the larger approach that we have to texts. And
it's a whale of an issue.
I was yeah, and it was making me think a little bit about the book, The Grammar of God by Avia Kushner, which I haven't read yet. I started it, but it's an interesting book that I'm looking forward to reading. And my understanding is that it's about a writer who went to study at the University of Iowa writing program with Marion Robinson, who's the author of a number of amazing pieces of literature, most famously Gilead, and I think the other one is called Housekeeping. And she's very connected to the Bible, but very connected to the English Bible, right? She's not Jewish, and she grew up reading the English Bible. And it's a story of the Jewish authors going to her class and being sort of struck by how, in her mind initially, much of what was being said was mistranslation, and I think that it's about an ultimate understanding that the Bible in English becomes simply a different work of literature that is also enormously powerful and enormously powerful for people, and that people have built lives around. And so it's not always a question of which is the correct reading, but also understanding that a work of literature can, in a sense, become a new work of literature over time. Battle doesn't have to be over the original intent, but also over the present meaning. And I think that's really interesting. What I wanted to add in terms of another thing that I was thinking about in looking at this text this year was that most of the prophets in the Hebrew Bible are called by God to prophesy to or against the Israelite kings, the kings of Israel, the kings of Judah. And that is made even sort of more clear by looking at this text as, in a sense, the exception that proves the rule. And here Jonah is being called to prophesy to or against the king of Assyria. It gets me thinking about in this season, it gets me thinking about this question that I feel like in our times, we seem to have the sense in many Jewish communal endeavors that the prophetic voice of Judaism is to be directed at non-Jews, right? That somehow having access to the prophetic voice in Judaism makes us more likely, or we should get involved in American politics, in civil rights movement and things like that, which of course we should. But it feels to me like we generally don't turn that prophetic voice on ourselves to that same extent anymore. And reading this text and thinking about it on Yom Kippur and looking at this as the exceptional text in which our prophetic voice was turned on non-Jews or on the larger world, which includes Jews, and that the rule is that our prophetic voice should be turned upon ourselves, makes me sensitive to the idea that let's go back and turn the prophetic voice upon ourselves. And here the prophetic voice can be misunderstood, I think, to be one that's essentially putting down those who are in power. And I don't think that that's the prophetic voice at its best. I think the prophetic voice at its best is a voice that's concerned about the future and that is, in a sense, warning those who are in power that if you don't think about these things in a different way, this bad future is going to be our fate and our doom. And it shouldn't be understood to be one that is just wagging a finger and saying, you are bad, any more so than we feel comfortable with the idea that our religious leaders would be wagging the finger at the congregation and saying, you're not living a good Jewish life. Instead, the conversation that we should be having and with each other is this question of what is going to happen if we continue along this route? And are we willing to shift course? And, it's so interesting that in the book of Jonah, unlike most of the cases in which the prophet turned usually his attention to the Israelite kings and the Israelite kings ignored the prophet or worse, that in this case, the king of Nineveh, the king of Assyria, actually listens to Jonah. And Jonah is somehow aggrieved by that, and I think it puts us, it raises a lot of really interesting questions about what prophecy is, what we should want it to be, to whom it should be directed, and what would happen if the prophetic voice was actually heard. And maybe this will be the year that some voices that are raising concerns about continuing on this new path and also offering a different path to go down, perhaps this year, and we'd say this every year, perhaps this year will be the year when we start to explore other paths even more vigorously than we currently are.
Sort of in closing for this whole project of mini episodes that we've been doing for these different readings, I thought that it might be important to also suggest with this book of Jonah that it's just a good story. Like in addition to all of the nuggets of wisdom that we can pull from elements of the story, from particular verses, and that's the same with all of these other texts. We sometimes fail to back out and recognize that we've got some just great literature in our Jewish toolbox of text. And I think that the book of Jonah is a great example of that. I think many of the books in the writings section of the Bible are good examples of that. And in addition to mining the depths of these texts for wisdom, I hope that this high holiday season and in the future, we can enjoy these pieces of literature as, fun, interesting, worthwhile texts to think about and learn from. I hope that this high holiday season, we were able to help with that through these various recordings. And I'd also encourage you to see if there's other ways to add bits and pieces to your experience, either through our High Holidays Unbound experience online on our website, judaismunbound.com, or through exploring the various offerings of other organizations too.
Yeah, and I just want to reinforce what you're saying and add to it this idea that, I don't think that we should get too hung up on why these texts were chosen for these holidays by the people who chose them long ago. I mean, I think that could be an interesting discussion in its own right, but I also think that it's almost like wandering through the stacks of the library and something catches your eye. I almost think the sort of randomness of having these texts available on these holidays is just something that allows us to be creative and to think, not why did the person who chose this text for this holiday choose it, but more, is there a connection that we can make through this random text and this random holiday, and actually something interesting comes out of it. And at least that's been kind of, to some extent, the spirit that I've been trying to explore these texts with. And I would really also encourage people to do that too. And if these texts don't speak to you, just open the book randomly to some other text, and when you're sitting either in synagogue or not in synagogue, just sort of open it to a random page and just kind of ask yourself this question: can I draw a meaningful connection between this text and this season? And I think that the creativity that kind of question that assumes that, yes, I can draw that kind of connection, and then the only question is, what is it going to be, is the kind of way of framing the question that opens up maximal creativity. And I really am hoping that our holidays can become these times of creativity when we're just kind of focused on Judaism for this day here and there, rather than seeing them as these days of kind of conservation of, like we talked about in an earlier episode, of like photocopying what was done in the past, but using them as these opportunities scattered throughout the year to just engage in creative thinking, and that creative thinking can be done literally by opening a random page and thinking about, is there some connection I could draw? I'd love to know what comes out on the other end of that.
Absolutely. And so on that note, we want to encourage you to be in touch with us. We didn't do this for all of our middle episodes, but because this is the final of our 8 mini episode series, we'd love to encourage you to be in touch with us. There's a few ways for you to do that. One is through our Facebook page, Judaism Unbound. Give us a like there. Another is through our website, JudaismUnbound.com, where you can find all of these recordings, and you can also find a variety of other fun, interesting, inspiring high holiday resources. And the last is that you can send us emails at lex@nextjewishfuture.org or dan@nextjewishfuture.org. And if you're really jazzed by what we produced and you'd like to support us with a small financial donation on a monthly basis, you can do so at our Patreon page, which you can find at www.patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Judaism Unbound. With that, this has been Judaism Unbound.